I'm Elaine Reyes at the United Nations headquarters in New York, and this is UN Insider.
Coming up.
It's high time for a ceasefire, along with the unconditional release of hostages.
Pressure mounts for an end to the conflict between Israel and Hamas. The Security Council backs a ceasefire plan. Will it be enough to stop the fighting and address the humanitarian crisis in Gaza?
I believe we're in the midst of a peaceful revolution.
A time of challenges and change. A wide-ranging conversation on Mexico's future. Stemming the flow of an environmental disaster. Efforts to clean up one of Latin America's longest rivers. Next.
There is increasing international pressure to bring an end to the fighting between Israel and Hamas. After 8 months of conflict, tens of thousands are dead, and the humanitarian situation in Gaza is dire.
Immediate realization of permanent ceasefire. This has been the strong appeal of China and the Council members for months. And this has been the most pressing aspiration of Gaza civilians in deep suffering.
This week, the Security Council passed a draft resolution backing a three-stage plan from the U.S. It calls for a ceasefire, freeing of hostages, and an immediate surge in aid to Gaza. The Secretary General also voiced his support for the proposal during a humanitarian conference on the situation in the Palestinian territory.
The horror must stop. It's high time for a ceasefire, along with the unconditional release of hostages. I welcome the peace initiative recently outlined by President Biden and urge all parties to seize this opportunity and come to an agreement.
From the Security Council to the briefing room and beyond, Zhu Deja is monitoring the latest developments inside the UN. Deja.
Yes, Elaine. This week, our focus is definitely on the latest developments over Gaza conflicts. So, 3 things to mention. First, this Monday, the Security Council finally adopted the U.S. draft resolution, endorsing and calling Hamas to accept a ceasefire deal that President Biden announced on 31st of May. The resolution, Resolution 2735, particularly said Israel accepted the new ceasefire proposal. But this is not what the Israeli representative said during that adoption meeting.
Israel will not let Hamas rearm or regroup so that Gaza can pose a threat to Israel. This is the unwavering goal that we are determined to achieve. This also means that Israel will not engage in meaningless and endless negotiations which can be exploited by Hamas as a means to stall for time.
Answering our confusion, here is what Mr. Robert Wood, Deputy Permanent Representative of the United States, said.
Israel has accepted this agreement. That has been clear. So it's Hamas's turn. Hamas needs to accept this deal.
That's not what the Israeli representative said in the council just now.
As I said earlier today, Israel has accepted this agreement. Hamas, up until now, has not. We want to see Hamas accept this agreement because it is a great opportunity to bring peace to the region.
When you say they accepted it, did they accept it in writing to the White House or something? Because publicly, we're not hearing those statements aligned.
As I said earlier, this agreement was something that Israel had put forward. So Israel supports this agreement. Let's be very clear about it.
As the story developed, we learned that Hamas has welcomed the resolution, and then later, U.S. Secretary of State Mr. Blinken said Hamas asked for numerous changes of the deal, and then Hamas denied what Mr. Blinken said, so I would say this is a really, really confusing situation. Second thing, UN's Commission of Inquiry released 2 parallel reports on October 7th attack and occupied Palestinian territory, accusing both Hamas and Israel of war crimes for mounting attacks against civilian populations and murder or willful killings. The reports, which covered the period up to the end of 2023, specifically accused Israel of crimes against humanity for torture, extermination, and gender persecution targeting Palestinian men and boys. What is the Secretary General's position?
Well, this is a report by the Commission of Inquiry. They spent a lot of work on it, and it's a very serious document. It will be now reviewed by the Human Rights Council, so we, for now, are leaving the matter in their hands. But obviously, there are many different reports involving human rights and the rights of different groups that have been focusing on the conflict in Gaza and the situation on October 7th, and all of those reports need to be looked at seriously.
Can it be an evidence for both Hamas and Israel that committed war crime?
Ultimately, it's up to the judicial bodies looking into questions about what sort of evidence they will use. We don't know what follow-up bodies there will be on the ground, but as you know, both the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice have been looking at the various situations, and it's up to them to determine what kind of information they will use as evidence.
And we all know that IDF executed an operation that freed 4 hostages in central Gaza. In the same operation, which reportedly covered up as a humanitarian convoy, also killed what Gaza Health Ministry claimed almost 300 Palestinians. What is the UN's reaction?
We, of course, welcome the news that the 4 hostages are free and reunited with their loved ones. The Secretary General, I think, expresses his extreme sorrow and his condemnation of the deaths of hundreds of Palestinian civilians and injuries to hundreds more that happened in the context of the operation.
Is it acceptable to use humanitarian convoy as disguise to conduct military operations?
Humanitarian aid must not be used and must not be perceived as taking any side in a conflict. The safety of our humanitarian workers depends on all sides and the communities on the ground trusting their impartiality. And that is something we will always try to reinforce.
One last thing, the release of annual report on children in armed conflict. Now, this is the first time that Israel was added to the UN list for violating children's rights. But let's be fair, not only Israel, both Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad's armed wing were also added to that list. The report said the conflict in Gaza has led to a 155% increase of what it called grave violations against children. The report shows that UN verified more than 8,000 grave violations against over 4,200 Palestinian children and 113 Israeli children in 2023. What does this list mean for Israel and Hamas?
You said it's not a legal finding. But don't you worry that if it's not legal finding, it's not legal binding, nobody would care about this report?
It is an action-oriented report that leads to my immediate engagement with listed parties to convince them to sign action plans to end and prevent those violations. If they so decide, they're all sovereign states or armed groups with their own ideas, they can decide to engage. If they decide to engage, we are under an obligation to provide technical assistance to that listed party in order for them to speedily stop the violation, release children if they are in their possession, and engage in prevention measures for the future.
It's worth noting that Sudan also recorded high numbers of violations against children. The UN said it has seen a staggering 480% increase in grave violations against children in Sudan. Another horrible effect by the waging war in these places. And that's all from me. Elaine.
Shudija, thanks.
It is so decided.
This week, the UN marked the first International Day for Dialogue Among Civilizations. The resolution establishing the day was put forward by China and aims to foster conversation and greater intercultural understanding.
文明对话
Dialogue among civilizations is an effective approach and essential path towards eliminating discrimination and bias, fostering mutual understanding and trust, facilitating people-to-people connection, and strengthening solidarity and cooperation. In September of this year, the United Nations will convene the Future Action Days Summit, aiming to propose systemic solutions to address the challenges faced by us. At this critical and historic moment, it holds special and profound significance for the United Nations to send a positive signal by advocating dialogue among civilizations and promoting mutual learning and exchanges between them.
The annual day has received broad support.
In the world today, we have seen a proliferation of division, of hate, of cultural adversity, and it is important for the United Nations to serve as the platform to promote intercultural exchanges, to promote tolerance amongst people and nations, and I think this is the objective of the Chinese initiative.
This International Day is an opportunity to shine a light on the potential of dialogue to build bridges across differences and equip our societies with the means to solve all the challenges.
Let's take a look at some of the other issues on the UN's agenda.
In the coming 5 years, China will contribute $20 million to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development to help implement the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and ensure that no country will be left behind.
China is taking steps to help support developing countries. Chinese President Xi Jinping delivered a video address as global leaders gathered in Geneva to discuss trade and development. President Xi noted UNCTAD's work, advancing cooperation and advocating for dialogue since its founding 60 years ago. Humanitarian groups are reaffirming their commitment to supporting civilians in Kharkiv. The conflict in Ukraine is in its third year and has resulted in the displacement of tens of thousands of people. The UN says more needs to be done to support persons with disabilities. A report on disability and development shows wide gaps persist when it comes to food security, health care, access to energy, and technology.
If we are truly committed to ensure community inclusion, independent living for persons with disabilities, then significant investment into disability inclusive care and support systems are needed.
Coming up.
Whether they are documented workers or undocumented workers, they are above all human beings.
UN Insider.
Whether it's about your education, the home you live in, or the items you buy, your money has a story to tell. Because every business story is a human story. Global Business.
What do you do when the tap goes dry? That's the question millions of people in Mexico City are facing. The sprawling metropolis could soon be unable to provide drinking water to residents, and many people are looking for more sustainable alternatives. Alistair Baverstock shows us how rainwater could provide a steadier source of drinking water.
The Mexico City metropolitan area, home to 21 million people, where water rationing is now a reality for many residents.
We have gone as long as a whole week without water and had to organise water truck deliveries ourselves because the government doesn't solve the problems.
While federal officials insist they're working on improvements to the supply problems, residents say they only see the situation getting worse and fear a day when there may be no water at all.
we're capturing from this roof up here.
One local company, Isla Urbana, or Urban Island, aims to decrease the dependence on that inconsistent supply by turning homes into individual rainwater harvesting units.
We capture the rain that falls on the rooftops, and that clean water goes into our tank. We pump it out with a pump, and it passes through a filter, and then it's clean for all domestic household uses.
Only drinking water must still be obtained elsewhere. Isla Urbana has installed more than 40,000 rain catchment systems across Mexico since its founding 15 years ago. But for these rainwater harvesting systems to provide homes with a meaningful supply, there of course must first be rain. And in these times of climate change, Mexico's traditional May to October rainy season has become anything but reliable.
It would start the 15th of May like clockwork. And now what I've seen over the last few years is the rainy season starting later and later. So yeah, it's definitely changing.
Isidro Cano is a Mexican meteorologist.
When the rains now arrive, they are abundant. We're talking about swollen rivers causing flooding across the country as we face a very intense rainy season.
As Mexico City faces the joint threats of not enough rain and then far too much, rainwater harvesting may allow its parched residents to get the balance just right.
Rainwater can be our only source of water during the rainy season, which is 5-6 months of the year. And so we can allow those systems, the dams, the aquifers, to recharge. So we don't get to these crisis points where it's the end of the dry season and there's not enough water for everybody.
Alistair Baverstock, CGTN, Mexico City.
Mexico is a founding member of the United Nations. I sat down with the country's UN ambassador, Hector Vasconcelos. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us.
On the contrary, thank you for coming to visit.
What are Mexico's and your UN priorities as permanent representative?
I would say that so far this year, our priorities would be, on the one hand, a new proposal for the General Assembly to approve concerning human rights of migrants. This summer, maybe in July or August, I hope we can present a new resolution to be approved by the General Assembly that would make it mandatory to observe the human rights of migrants independently of their legal condition. You see, that whether they are documented workers or undocumented workers, they are above all human beings, and we believe very deeply that the basic human rights have to be respected by all nations. Another priority for me is to try and revive a proposal that the President of Mexico made that has to do with reducing inequality and poverty around the world. And the idea was that the main corporations and the main banks in the world would have a certain percentage of their annual profits devoted to a fund, to an international fund run by the United Nations that would be dispersed to the poorest areas in the world. This would be in response to something that we believe is one of the major problems in the planet, really, which is the concentration of power and less than 1% of the population, of the world population.
Mexico is a founding member of the United Nations. It was a member of the UN Security Council very recently in 2021, 2022, 4 times. What is Mexico's perspective when it comes to reforming the UNSC as it's been discussed for many years now?
Well, in fact, during the last few years, Mexico, together with France, presented a proposal for changing the dynamics, let's say, of the Security Council. We deeply believe that as long as only 5 nations of the world have the veto power and can therefore stop any action by the United Nations around the world. Even with the veto of one single nation, of one of 5 permanent members of the Security Council, we think that that is contrary to the whole idea of the United Nations as an effective international organization.
You can't have a conversation about Mexico without discussing the issue of migration. What are UN agencies doing to help the humanitarian issues around migration?
Well, we've been working for many years, but especially in the last 5 years or so, in improving the conditions of those people who have to wait on the Mexican side. We have been trying to improve the spaces where these people are held in Mexico before they enter the United States, and also the transportation from Central America, from Guatemala, all the way through Mexico and into the United States. It's a long, long trip that they have to undertake, sometimes by train, sometimes walking, in terrible circumstances. Also, we've been offering job possibilities for working in Mexico, which many people have actually taken as an option.
What are your concerns about artificial intelligence?
I happen to believe that it is one of the central issues that the world faces. On the one hand, as we all know, it offers almost unlimited possibilities. That's the positive side of it. But also, artificial intelligence is a very, very, unless it is well regulated, it would be a great threat to humanity in the sense that, again, as it is in public opinion now, that they could eventually gain control of crucial decisions from humankind. So it's a major, major issue. I often say that together with climate change and the concentration of wealth in less than 1% of the world population, I would call those three the deepest, the gravest problems that humankind faces.
Ambassador, history was made in Mexico with voters electing the country's first female president, Claudia Sheinbaum. I want to get your reaction to that significant milestone.
Well, I will start by saying that as a diplomat, I am very conscious of the fact that I represent here at the United Nations the whole of Mexico, the Mexican state, not only the government, and therefore I shouldn't really talk too much about internal politics. But at the same time, I cannot forget that I'm a founder member of the party that won. For many reasons, this was a very historical and significant election. First of all, it will be the first time in our history that we have a woman president. I believe we're in the midst of a peaceful revolution in Mexico, and we have been in such situations since 2018.
She's an accomplished woman. She's also a climate scientist.
Absolutely.
How will that background perhaps help Mexico in dealing with climate change? And with that being such an issue at the UN as well?
Sure. I think that would be at the center of her concerns, the whole fight against climate change. Climate change is already a reality in today's world. It affects the entire planet. But to the degree that it is possible to fight it, still, climate change, it will be done, and it will be one of the priorities for the new president of Mexico, in my view.
Ambassador Vasconcelos, thank you so much for joining us.
On the contrary, thank you so much for your visit. Thank you.
Coming up.
When it rains, it makes a puddle, and that puddle is brought down by the river. And the river passes here, and it is black and stinking.
Guatemala's largest river has turned into an environmental hazard. The Motagua River is severely polluted with garbage. It now contains 3% of the world's plastic pollution. Andres Suarez Jaramillo shows us the problem.
This is one of the most polluted rivers in Latin America. The Motagua River receives daily garbage from more than 1 million people living in Guatemala. This is the case of Saturnino Muyus, who lives near a mountain where people often dump garbage illegally. During the rainy season, the river rises and carries all the garbage with it.
When it rains, it makes a puddle, and that puddle is brought down by the river. And the river passes here and it is black and stinking. It doesn't even let you sleep because of the stench that comes from the river.
In response to the environmental emergency, the government of Guatemala allowed the NGO Ocean Cleanup to install an interceptor in a stream of the river to prevent millions of tons from continuing to reach the Gulf of Honduras and the Caribbean Sea.
But the most serious thing about this river is the great accumulation of non-recyclable materials, such as Duraport, which is one of the major pollutants. And there we can see a large accumulation of plastics of different types. Plastic bags, remains of utensils, ending up on the Honduran coasts, which is the main problem.
In April 2024, this interceptor managed to capture 1,400 tons of plastic in a single rainy night, which was then shredded and transformed into other elements.
From this side, the material comes out, and this machine helps us bring the material up to the other machine. And then there is a heating process that melts the plastic, and the final result is this kind of pole.
The new government in Guatemala agreed to a public-private partnership to save this river within 10 years, although one of the solutions is to install a greater number of garbage interceptors along the river. The main challenge is to attack the root of the problem, that is to achieve a cultural and administrative change so that millions of Guatemalans do not throw their garbage into the river that reaches the world's oceans.
I'm Elaine Reyes at UN headquarters in New York. Thanks for being a UN Insider.